Hej och varmt välkomna till dagens extrainsatta seminarium, och jag heter Lotta Borguan och ansvarar för Nordea Private Banking. Det är mycket som sker i världen. Vi har inte bara geopolitiska oroligheter, vi har också ett val som sker i början av november, och jag är jätteärad och glad att idag ska vi få höra och lyssna in med Alistair Ross om vad är det som sker där ute och hur ska vi tänka och förbereda oss. Alistair är country editor på The Economist, och han har en lång erfarenhet som redaktör och har skrivit rapporter om olika länder, riskanalyser och geopolitik. Han har också suttit i styrelsen för The Economist Intelligence Unit. Han har en omfattande bakgrund när det kommer till global ekonomi och politik som gör honom till en eftertraktad talare i ämnet i hela världen. Så jag är otroligt ärad och glad att få idag prata med honom om vad som sker där ute, vad som sker i världen. Både globalt, geopolitiskt, men också länkat till det amerikanska valet som vi står inför. Det valet som kommer ge ett globalt avtryck. Allt ifrån utrikespolitik till investeringsstrategier till internationella relationer. Och det är viktigt för oss alla för att förstå vad är det som ligger bakom det här och vad är de möjliga konsekvenserna. Alistair kommer dela med sig av sina analyser, och han kommer ge oss en tydligare bild på de bakomliggande faktorerna och vad vi kan förvänta oss. Han kommer bryta ner de här komplexa globala sambanden och med sin brittiska humor hjälpa oss att förstå vad som sker och ge oss en insiktsfull analys. Jag ser fram emot det här, så låt oss köra igång. Warm welcome to Nordea Private Banking here in Stockholm. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you. Always well when I'm here in Stockholm. It's a great city.
And thank you for bringing the London weather to Stockholm. It's raining cats and dogs at the moment.
Well, you're very welcome. I would gift it to you all the time if I could, and enjoy some sunshine in London. That's not how it works.
We look forward to that. A lot of stuff is going on in the world at the moment. Do you want to give your 5 cents? What is the big picture? Where are we at the moment?
Oof, that's a big question. I think, to put it in a nutshell, the four horsemen of the apocalypse are out there riding through the landscape. Everything's going on at the moment. It's there's a tremendous amount of upheaval, but obviously we've got a simmering war in the Middle East, which could go in any direction. We've got the long-running assault on Ukraine by Russia, which continues to have ramifications well beyond that region. We've got the long-developing contestation between the West and the United States in particular, and China, which continues to put on muscle as a global power, overturning our assumptions about how peaceful the world was going to be when 20 years ago or so we thought everything was going to be smooth and straightforward, and of course it hasn't turned out that way at all. I think it's worth saying that you can pick out these hotspots and these particular events around the world at the moment, but it's important to draw back a bit and think about the deeper trends, the deeper forces that are reflected in all of these symptoms, if you like, in all of these events. And I think what we're seeing is a major realignment of global power. The tectonic plates of geopolitics, if you like, are in motion. And we don't know where they're going to settle. And when tectonic plates move, you get earthquakes, you get localized events, but they all reflect these deeper trends. I think that's certainly what we're seeing. And as we try and scan the horizon, it's important to remember that there are these deeper drivers, deep ideological drivers, how the world should work, how national governance should work, which are the right models, the personalities are emerging that draw our attention, but it's the deeper trends, I think, that really matter. And of course we have elections just around the corner in the United States, which are going to be decisive in many ways, not just for Americans, but for everybody in the world.
So these deeper trends that have been with us for a long time, they are now, we can see them happening, as you say, both in Russia, in Ukraine, in Middle East, and so forth. But how, particularly around the Middle East, how worried should we be here now, do you think?
Again, I would answer that on two levels. I mean, on the specific level of people lobbing weapons at each other over the Middle East, does certainly cause a great deal of cause for concern. I think that the tendency, Israel has, regardless of one's views about the proportionality of its response, it has changed the picture on the basis of the skill that it's demonstrated in tactical and strategic approach to what's going on there. Netanyahu was in deep trouble before anything broke out, probably in deeper trouble the day after the incursion by Hamas operatives into Israel. But I think that's been turned around. I think the Israeli population is probably pretty much foursquare behind Netanyahu and the government's approach at the moment to quelling its enemies. But I do think and I think that among those enemies, if you like, Iran clearly being the most powerful, the most important, you still see a reluctance to go all out against Israel. I think Israel would quite like, I think Netanyahu, his personality and his approach to this, would quite like to see this extend into a deeper, wider conflict, because it gives him the opportunity to put the threat posed by Iran and its proxies back into the box, if you like. I think Israel probably has the capacity to do that. Yes. And he's sort of itching for this fight, and particularly for the opportunity to severely disrupt and put back Iran's nuclear program. I think he would love that opportunity. At the moment, the people around him and the Americans are trying to restrain that instinct and trying to hold the conflict back from that. I think that would be a scenario that we can't rule out. That Israel, as it's shown, Netanyahu, as he's shown, will act unilaterally, ignore the restraints being put around him, and go for the nuclear sites in Iran. It seems less probable, it's less than 50-50, but it's definitely a possibility, and that would quite seriously change the game, I think, in the Middle East.
Yeah, because then you go from I'm not going to say this a smaller conflict, but it started out a year ago, a more isolated conflict, to a broader global conflict. And how could then that play out?
Again, I think that's a low probability scenario. It's not what I would expect to happen, but it's not one we can rule out. When there's so much uncertainty around, what matters for businesses, investors, governments is plotting through these scenarios, thinking them through, however unlikely they seem, so that should they occur, you're ready. And you're right. That there is the potential here for this regional contest to blow up into a more global conflagration. I mean, you can see the routes by which it could happen. Iran's proxies have been busy in Lebanon and in Yemen and in the Gaza Strip, but so far we haven't seen any activity from, for example, Iranian proxies in Iraq, who could take the fight directly to Americans on American bases, in Iraq. If that were to happen, that would draw America to make a direct response. At the moment, it's backed Israel. It's provided Israel with intelligence and logistics, but there's been no direct assault by America, if you like, on those Iranian proxies. So you can see suddenly how these things could start to escalate. And what we've seen so far is a classic pattern of escalation. And every time you think it's all going to blow up, well, it doesn't blow up, but it does get another ratchet further on.
It gets broader and broader, and that's what I mean. It started in a limited geographical area, and now it gets broader and broader. More countries get engaged. And
I don't think this is the spark for a major global confrontation between powers. You can never rule these things out, but it doesn't look to me like that's the way this is headed. I think there are other areas of competition that are more concerning from that point of view.
And what are those areas? If you broaden out the perspective a little bit, what are that? What is that concern that you're thinking about?
I mean, I don't want to paint, cataclysmic scenarios here. That I think, these things are on everybody's mind. The very fact that Russia chose to invade Ukraine with a clear intention, I think, at the time of toppling the Ukrainian regime and turning Ukraine into a new Belarus, a puppet state with no fundamental sovereignty of its own. I think that's pretty clear. And the fact that Putin was willing to do that and thought that was in his interest to do it gives a sense of what his thinking is about how he would like to operate. And so I think that where he's ended up, which is in this sort of frozen conflict, this war of attrition along barely mobile front lines, long and painful meat grinders and all this horrible stuff that's happening, is a long way back from where he wants to be, which suggests that given the opportunity, he will expand his assault on Western interests. I remember years ago being in Finland and people there saying that one of their main concerns was Russia and the threat that they posed. And I have to admit, to my shame, I thought, I understand the paranoia because they're so close to Russia, but that's what it is, basically paranoia. Clearly, that wasn't the case, and there are reasons to worry about the Baltic states and about Putin's wider ambitions. Should those be given the chance to express themselves, then there doesn't seem to be a limit on his willingness to provoke the West. And given the shifting patterns that we've already talked about in the geopolitical balance, it's not hard to imagine how that could tip over into a much more direct confrontation between NATO, Russia, Russian proxies and Russian allies, with China in the wings, waiting to take advantage of whatever situation arises. That seems to be a more likely route to the kind of sum of all fears that we all have in the back of our mind.
You mentioned China here. I think it's important to think about, if you look at the world at large, I mean, you have the superpower of China, you have Europe, you have the US, and everyone is producing goods, of course, and there is always this trade kind of fighting. What is your take on trade in the world at the moment?
Well, I think one of the things that, one of the formative experiences I remember from my youth, which was a long, long time ago, but I still remember it.
Not too long, I think.
Was going through school and knowing that there was this sort of confrontation between America and Russia. The Soviet Union and the Soviets were the bad guys and Americans were the good guys and we were the good guys, obviously. And realizing that while all of this rhetoric was going on and this sort of fear on a daily basis of Russians lobbing nuclear weapons over into the West, actually the trade relationship between Russia and America was incredibly important and very, very vital. It was very, very active. Russia was a huge provider of goods to America and vice versa. And I remember thinking at the time, hang on, there are two things happening here. One is the fears and concerns and ambitions from a geopolitical perspective, and the other is the day-to-day practical operations of a global economy.
Yes. And
that global economy today, right now, continues to operate in as efficient a way as it can given the circumstances. I think it's become less efficient because of what's happening. We're seeing a more isolationist instinct coming through.
Protectionism,
nearshoring, friendshoring, those kinds of things. And those are inefficiencies in the supply chain without a doubt.
And you can see that also in my discussions with businesses, with political elections, and what have you. It's across the board, actually, this kind of turning into yourself a little bit more, protecting yourself.
I think it's the right thing for companies to be doing, to be looking at their supply chains, asking themselves seriously, how confident can we be that this long extended supply chain, very sort of thin, often with very little redundancy built in, how confident can we be that that's going to stand us in good stead as global events develop? And I think many companies, as you say, are thinking we need to double protections. We need to bring supplies a little closer to home. We need to build firmer partnerships with our suppliers and our distributors. We need, supply chains that we have more confidence in. I think that's exactly the right reaction. But it is an inefficiency in the system.
A lot of stuff is going on in the world, everything from the geopolitical instability, a willingness to, as we say, protect yourself and so forth. But there is also stuff in the US going on, right? We have less than a month for the US election. Harris is, can I say, a relatively new candidate that's done a fantastic takeoff in her campaigning, so forth. What is your hunch? Like, where are we in the US now? Who has the upper hand, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, partly because this election will come. There are a couple of 100 million voters in America, and this vote is going to come down to 150,000 of them, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny number. It's a sliver of the electorate in America that are ultimately going to be decisive in which way this goes.
Explain a bit to us in the audience, why is it that there are so many millions of voters that comes into those 150?
There are a couple of reasons. One is because the American system is very well entrenched. They've been operating the same system for many, many decades. And there's been this process of gerrymandering over the years where states have sort of reshaped themselves to almost guarantee that the vote will go one way or the other. In many states in America, the outcome's already known, long before the election, because the parties have gathered their voters into constituencies that they can rely on. So that means that the vote comes down to just a few swing states where there really is the option of going from one way to the other, because the vote is so finely balanced.
And which are those? Pennsylvania, I guess.
Pennsylvania,
Ohio.
Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia. So there are just a few, and they will decide the outcome of this election. So that makes it very hard to predict, because you can see the popular vote across the country probably leaning quite firmly towards Harris, I would think. But as we know, winning the popular vote is only half the battle. You've got to go deeper down into the electoral system. You've got to win the electoral college votes state by state and build up a majority in the electoral college, and that's a very different battle that's being fought. So it's hard to predict, but the betting markets, for what it's worth, lean towards Harris.
But it's pretty cold. It's pretty close shot, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. There is nobody out there who's confidently, except the spin doctors, but there's nobody else who's confidently saying this vote's going to go one way or another. My hunch is that it leans still towards the Democrats, and I've felt that since Biden, not after the first debate with Biden, where I sort of lost my confidence a little in my trust in the Democrats to be able to go all the way, but certainly since before then, and since the changeover to the Harris-Walz partnership, my feeling is that there's momentum behind the Democrats. There are things operating in their favour, despite the fact that truth doesn't seem to matter at all. It does matter a little, and the economy is going their way, the Democrats' way, and that's always really important, even if millions of people fail to recognise it. There are key issues like reproductive rights, which I think do play into an important constituency for the Democrats. Women vote more than men do, and they lean more Democrat. So that's an important, more important than it appears from where it sits on people's list of priorities. So,
what other priorities are there? Is if women's rights is one priority, what are the other top priorities that really change?
The economy is always number one, and that's what people say when you ask them. And it's also pretty obvious because it's your daily life. How do you feel about your prospects for work, for income, for buying a car? All these things all come from the economic prospects that you judge each candidate to be able to promise. My issue with that is, as I said, although it seems to me that at a macro level, in normal times the economy would be a strong tailwind behind the Democrats, nobody seems to be paying a lot of attention to the truth at the moment. So, everything that happens is spun one way or another, and it all depends on which tribe you belong to, what you believe. But the economy is the number one issue. Immigration is important. There's been sort of spun up into a I think a largely falsely important issue that's got a lot of people concerned. National security is always an important issue, and things like education, healthcare appear lower down, but they're still, they can still sway important constituencies and voters.
Well, so the upper hand is with the Democrats at the moment. So what's going to happen if Harris wins the election? What are the biggest shifts that she stands for?
Yeah, she's in many ways, it looks like an easy answer to say it's a continuation of where we are. Yeah. This is sort of Biden's successor, Biden's chosen successor, and she'll continue more or less with his program. There are a couple of things I think that cut across that. One is that her temperament isn't the same as Biden's. She's closer to the progressive wing of the party. In conviction, I think she's more, perhaps a little bit less pragmatic than Biden has proved to be, and a bit more conviction-led. So I think that would tend to push towards a more progressive agenda on things like, free education, forgiveness of student debts, on things like free healthcare, single-payer healthcare, as they call it. On these issues, perhaps a little bit more reluctant to engage in trade agreements. A bit like Trump in that sense, except for very different reasons. She's a little less trustful of the impact that trade agreements have on labor rights and the like. So she may be a little bit more reluctant to push ahead on trade integration. So there are differences between her and Biden. But the other major factor is, of course, it doesn't really matter what you want to do. What matters is what you can do. And there will be, just as there have been severe limits on what Biden's been able to do with his program, although he has achieved some extraordinary things, she would face similar limits on what she could do. When we saw, for example, just a small example, it's in her conviction, it's in her temperament to be against fracking. And she was against fracking, as you always would have expected she would be, until suddenly she wasn't, because the campaign required that she ditch this commitment. And now she's in favour of fracking. So, everything can change according to what the system will allow you to do, what you need to do to retain power, to retain your base. And that puts an extreme limitation on what she can achieve. So I think, generally speaking, a bit more leaning more progressive than Biden, but otherwise, more or less in the same direction. And
what can happen to the economy? You say the economy is the top thing that voters are caring about, and clearly our customers are very much caring about the economy, the investment environment, stock exchange, and so forth. We all have quite big exposures to the US. So if Harris wins, what happens to the economy, and how does the outlook for investment look like, do you think?
One of the interesting questions to ask about the US election is not what's different between the two candidates, but what stays the same. Because although this whole thing is set up as this almost, Manichean battle between two points of view, which to some degree it is stylistically, underneath there are areas of agreement, and I think they're important when you're thinking about how the economy is going to progress from here. One of them is that both Harris and Trump and both of their campaigns are centered more than usual on the idea that America needs to maintain and consolidate its position in the world as number one. And that means that sacrifices will be made in terms of economic efficiency, things like globalization, trade agreements, and relations with rivals and allies.
Are we back to that protectionism then?
I think
protecting your own territory, both in terms of trade and safety.
And I think that is throwing sand in the gears of the global economy. I think that's all things considered, that's a negative from the point of view of economic progression. They're both, I think, focused in a way that Obama, for example, wasn't on China as an explicit, recognized rival, a competitor, not necessarily an enemy per se, but a competitor that needs to be taken on. So this idea, I mean, the extreme of the other side of this idea was where we were around the year 2000, when China was invited into the WTO, and the feeling at the time was, this is going to we're going to catch China in this liberal trap, because they're going to find themselves having to open up and having to liberalize politically, because the prize of being part of this sort of global system is too great to refuse. It didn't work out that way. I mean, they liberalized economically, but politically they're probably more centralized and authoritarian than they were even back then. The recognition initially by Trump, the public recognition that, hang on a second, this isn't the way we deal with China. China has to be taken on as a rival. That is now mainstream. At the time it felt very rude. We don't like rudeness in our countries, and it seemed very rude the way Trump was approaching this issue. But I think now it's mainstream pretty much everywhere. China is seen as a competitor on many levels, and countries Europe has just applied really punitive tariffs against China's EV car exports, and that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. So these things are fundamental drivers that are going to stay the same whoever wins in November, and I think that they're going to hold back economic growth. That said, I take my hat off to the Fed in America and central banks across the rich economies who've managed to engineer a soft landing. I think that's where we are now. We feared coming out of the pandemic, we thought we're heading into a recession. There hasn't been one. Let's not mention Germany. There hasn't been a recession. So generally speaking, economies are, I think at the moment, are far more stable, in a better position than we thought they would be 2 or 3 years ago. And that's a positive. It's as true for America as it is for Europe and for much of the world. So generally speaking, my sense is that economic prospects are stable, some way below where you would want them to be, but a long way above where they might have been. I hope that's specific enough for your...
I think so. And coming back to Harris versus Trump, we now got a little bit more insight what Harris stands for. But what will change if Trump wins the election? What are your main thinking here?
Yeah, I think there are some important ways in which Trump 2 will be like Trump 1, and some important ways in which it will be different. The ways it will be the same, or in fact, more intensely so than before, are about style. We know what he's like as a rhetorician. We know what he's like in foreign relations, in his transactional relations with other leaders about the world, and that's not going to change. So we need to brace ourselves for what's going to be, this gale of illiberal language and deeply transactional relations with everybody internally and externally in the United States. It's not what we've been used to. It's not what we think of as the way diplomacy and foreign relations work at their best. And it's not just style. It is style because it's his way, the way he confronts the world, but it also has practical implications in how America's allies in particular deal with the United States administration. So that's just like Trump 1. That's the same all over again. And we can expect that. We know to a degree how to deal with it, when to take it at face value, when to understand that it's rhetoric and it's about stirring his base rather than actually achieving recognizable measures on the ground.
But isn't that one of the biggest risks for businesses, at least? Not knowing how to plan long term. I mean, businesses like long-term planning horizons, knowing where the politician stands, where the economy stands and so forth, and then you plan. But that's what we've seen in Trump 1. It's been a lot of back and forth and uncertainty.
Yeah.
That businesses don't like uncertainty, markets doesn't like uncertainty. Will we have more certainty this time, or will we have to keep living in this Twitter or X type of screening?
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that, because I think on the one hand there'll be less certainty because Trump will be less predictable than, say, a Harris Democrat would be, because that will be more conventional. Trump will be unconventional. That's his whole style. That makes things more uncertain. But let's not forget that you can make the case that Trump is merely a symptom of deeper shifts in global attitudes, the global sense of security, the global sense of outrage that our politicians have let us down has given rise to this sort of wave of populism, of which Trump is an example. So there are deeper things going on, and they are inherently uncertain. So we do live in a world which is more uncertain than it was.
Yes.
And I think the overlay here of the way modern technology, social media, is developing as pretty much a Wild West. This was seen as a good thing 20 years ago, that we should let the internet get on with it and not try and over-regulate. Probably there was no alternative. That's the only way it was that's the way it was going to go anyway, because it's virtually unregulatable. But we see now this sort of fluorescence of, I don't want to use too strong language, but one side of social media is pure bile, violence, lies, distortion, deception, and advocacy for every cause, whatever its merits. That's exploded across the world. And that's changed, I think, people's perception of how confident, how certain they can be about how the world works. So I think those three things actually all point towards a less certain future. And we have these sort of tectonic movements in geopolitics that are still shaking themselves out. We don't know where that's going to settle. Who can say what the relationship between China and the West is going to be in 2035 or 2050? We can guess, but we really don't know. So, we have to be ready for a more uncertain world. And yet, I think, I take what you say, that businesses value above all a sense of certainty and a sense of predictability. I'm afraid you're going to have to do without it, because it's, you have to impose your own certainty by building in redundancy, building in security, resilience, these watchwords that are becoming more and more important in business. They're just there, and we're going to be living with them for some time to come.
So we discussed a lot now what's going on in the big picture, both what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. We talked a lot about China and the imbalances in trade. You mentioned also the import taxes that happen now in Europe. We talked a lot about the election, what happens if Harris wins, Trump wins, what are the similarities? Just to finish off, if you look ahead, you alluded a little bit to, if you look to 2030, 2040, 2050, what are the big trends looking ahead now? And what should we in this room in Sweden be curious about?
Yeah, geopolitics will set that aside, because that is, the world rubbing against each other and this sort of friction going on, causing all these sparks and conflict. And I think that we've talked about that, so let's set that aside. But I think there are a number of deeper trends that you can keep an eye on. These are things you can monitor, and you can inform yourself and get a sense of where they're going. And I'd pick out three, I think. One of them is climate.
Yes.
It's been clear for a long time that this was an increasingly important aspect of human life, how we're going to adjust post-industrial revolution, a deeper understanding now of what that industrial revolution has cost in terms of climate. There's an awful lot of noisy rhetoric. We were talking before about, the lies and distortions that we see online, but there is deeper down a broad recognition pretty much everywhere that the climate is vulnerable to our behaviour, and that we can do something about it. So I think that transition is well underway. We're well on that process. Bets have been placed on the table by governments, by businesses, in green energy, in the green transition. You know, well, we're going to bet on batteries. Okay, we're going to bet on smart grids, and we're going to bet on wind. We're going to bet on energy, on nuclear, whatever. These bets are being made in a big way. Think of the IRA in the United States. You know, these are major reallocations of resources, national resources and business resources. So that's happening, and that is going to be transformative for businesses in how they present themselves to their public, in how they operate, in how they set up their supply chains, and in how they, in the technology that they adopt, you know, the capital expenditure that they allocate to becoming greener and more sustainable. That's a trend that's going to be going on for some time, very deep, very long term. Another one is demographics. Always important, you know, always central to questions like productivity and the provision of public services around the world. Demographics always press on these, but we are going through we're seeing sort of patterns at the moment in demographics that are having a big impact, country by country, but also globally.
And also here in Sweden, I mean, a woman gives birth to on average 1.5 children.
Yeah.
And as immigration is not happening in the same speed as we've done in the past, we see actually a net outflow of people.
Yeah.
So we have no growth anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that is not only, as you say, a Swedish perspective or the Swedish phenomena. It's something that happens.
Yeah, I think Sweden's a very good example. You know, you have this this dependency ratio which is shifting against you. Then you have all the rhetoric about immigration, which you say, hang on a second, you know, we need these immigrants. We need the competence. Yeah, we need to balance our population. A growing economy depends on having the right numbers of people in the right skilled areas to be able to deploy them in the labour force. And if we're not producing them domestically, as it were, you know, we need to welcome these people in and put them to work. So you can already see an awful lot of the populism that we're seeing on the rise around Europe is a reaction to a sense that the difficult times we've been going through since really the Great Recession is down to, you know, this inflow of immigrants who are taking jobs and who are taking resources. All nonsense, I think, but understandably that issue is vulnerable to that kind of manipulation by populists. Yes. So demographics is an important driver. China has hit a demographic watershed where its population has peaked and is now getting older. And that normally happens, you hope that happens when you're a fast developing country, when your GDP per capita has reached a certain level that you can afford it. That's not really the case in China. China's not nearly as well off on a per capita basis as, for example, Japan was when it hit the same demographic threshold. So that's a concern for China. Technology may help them get over that hump, but it's a concern and one to watch. And demographics plays into situations all over the world. In Africa, it's the other side of the coin. You have a very fast-growing young population. And these people are a tremendous opportunity, but they're also a tremendous threat. If you can't put them to work, then you end up with situations like you got in Tunisia with the Arab Spring. You know, people rebelling against their governments out of dissatisfaction with their opportunities. So demographics is relatively predictable. You can see it play out over the long term, and you can play out the scenarios. That's an important driver.
More predictable than climate is, for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and more predictable than geopolitics, I would say.
Definitely.
And the third area I would, similarly long term, similarly constantly going through thresholds, constantly surprising us with the developments that emerge, is technology. And by technology, you know, technology started out, the first technological revolution possibly was fire or the wheel. You know, we're not talking about that anymore, but we're talking now about AI, about what our extraordinary, innovative creativity as humans has delivered to us in terms of our machines and our process and our techniques. and artificial intelligence, I think, and the broader digital transition is one of these long-term driving trends that businesses are going to have to get to grips with, make bets on at an early stage, which businesses hate to do. You know, we don't know how this is going to turn out, but you still have to put your money on the table. I think my feeling is that AI is really transformative, really, really deeply transformative. And when it's happened, you know, in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, we'll look back and say, oh yeah, we knew that was going to happen. From here, it looks almost like sort of magic. We don't understand how it's going to work, but it is one of these deeper, long-term trends that I think is well worth keeping an eye on.
If you go back 25 years, we had the first, we started using internet, right? I remember in 1999, I got my first email address 25 years ago, and obviously the rise and growth of internet is completely changed how we live our life and interact with each other. Is the shift of AI bigger than that?
I think it's a really, really good question and very hard one to answer. You know, is the next wave coming in from the ocean going to be bigger than the one that came before? It's not an easy question to answer, but again, I can only go on a hunch. I would think it's the same kind of size, but potentially its impact on how businesses operate and how we live our daily lives will be greater, because the internet was above all a communication tool, and how we communicate, how we process information, how we store information is vital to human life, to human development, and always has been. You know, the invention of writing and the printing press, that was the kind of thing that the internet was. The difference with AI and this whole generation of the Internet of Things and machine learning and tying up machine learning into machines, into machinery, is that they have agency, which the internet has never really had. So the internet is just a tool that we use. AI will do things on its own. It will do the things we ask it to. It may not always do them in the way we asked it to do it or in predictable ways, but it will take control of things. The classic case, I'm sorry to leap straight to this one, but is armaments. You know, military. You imagine giving AI control over not just targeting, but also firing weapons. AIs versus AIs. It sounds very Terminator, but it's there. You know, the capability is there already, and AI is developing so incredibly quickly. 5 years is a long time now. We look ahead 5 years, where will AI be? You know, it will be somewhere a long way further on than where it is now. So I think these are AI in that sense, that it can drive our cars, it can operate our machines, it can diagnose our illnesses, it can model our scenarios. AI has a capacity, an agency that I don't think the internet ever had. So in that sense, it's more profound.
Many thanks for your insights. Many thanks for the broad discussion we've had on a various amount of topics. We very much appreciate you spending time with us here and sharing the views with all our customers out there. So big thanks for listening in, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.